Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Market Performance and Planning Forum. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. The presentation for today's call is available on the User Groups and Recurring Meetings webpage of the California ISO website. Today's call is being recorded, and the video file will be available for a limited time on that same page. The recording is for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. We will be taking questions throughout the call today, and you can enter the question queue at any time by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. I'd just like to remind everyone to please start by introducing themselves before asking a question. The objective of the Market Performance and Planning Forum is to enable a dialogue on implementation planning and market performance issues. So today we'll be reviewing key market performance topics as well as sharing updates to the 2020 release plans. This results from inputs we received from stakeholders. And then we'll be providing information on specific initiatives. This is to support market participants in budget and resource planning. And the Market Performance and Planning Forum focuses more on implementation planning rather than the actual policy. We will be clarifying implementation timelines through this forum and discussing external impacts of implementation plans. And then through this forum, we also launched joint implementation planning processes. So the agenda for today's forum, we will start off with a market performance and quality update from our market analysis and forecasting team. And then we'll move into a policy update by Brad Cooper and John Gooden. And then we'll wrap up today's call with a release update from Adrian Chiesi. So with that, I will hand it over to our first presenter, Guillermo Bautista Alderte from Market Analysis and Forecasting.
Thank you, Isabella. Good morning, everybody. This is Guillermo. We're going to start this morning discussion with the market update section. We have 4 specific topics to discuss. We're going to start first with the gas constraints covered by Abhishek. Then we're going to move on discussing CRR performance and touching some recent trends of curtailments and renewable production. And then we are going to move into the discussion of the COVID-19 impacts on the CAISO system, specifically on the load forecast and prices. The reminder of the deck includes the standard metrics that touches all the areas of the market. We don't expect to go over each of those specifically, but if you have specific questions on specific areas of the reminder of the deck, we will be able to cover those. With that, I will pass it to Abhishek to go through the first topic.
Thanks, Guillermo. Hello, everyone, and good morning. This is Abhishek Undiwali from Market Analysis and Forecasting. So let's start with the max burn gas nomogram. So ISO did enforce the max burn gas nomogram for a few days in the month of April, May, and June due to planned curtailments on the gas system. SoCal Gas issued a planned curtailment for ISO dispatch generation in the San Diego area due to a line outage on the gas system. The curtailment was basically in effect from April 7th to April 11th. This is the first instance of gas burn nomogram. Due to the gas curtailment, ISO had to enforce the gas nomogram. This nomogram was similar to what ISO had enforced back in November, which was a flat curve for all the hours in the day. This localized curtailment was basically limited to the city of Carlsbad and Miramar, and only 4 MMCF per hour gas was available for each day for the remainder of the generation in the San Diego territory. So the limit was basically, for the this nomogram limit was basically a 4 MMCF per hour as a flat line curve. There was another set of curtailment notices from SoCal Gas for maintenance work on the gas system, that is from May 11th to May 15th, and another set from May 29th to June 12th in the whole southern gas system. These instances on gas nomogram had a different flavor because this was basically based on the daily limitation of the gas supply or the generation in the southern gas system. The southern gas system is basically includes the San Diego area and the east of Marino forecast zones. Due to the gas limitation, this daily limitation is basically distributed across the hours by a ratio of hourly load forecast to the daily load forecast. Next slide, please. Thank you. This slide basically provides the average hourly gas burn comparison between the RTD and the IFM markets, and it shows the limits of the Nomogram in both these markets across all the instances of Nomogram in force. That is for the April month, for the May 11 to May 15, and from May 29 to June 12. For April 7 to April 11, as mentioned before, it was a flat gas Nomogram, that is the max burn Aliso San Diego underscore flat Nomogram was enforced with a limit of 4 mmCF across the hours that you can see from the green and the yellow dotted lines. That is the limit is 4 mmCF. This Nomogram, the Nomogram was enforced in RTD up to April 10th, hour ending 17, as the maintenance work had already ended. By the time the day-ahead market had already run and was already enforced in the Nomograms, the day-ahead market had the Nomogram up to 11th of April. However, the RTD market was, the Nomogram was enforced in the RTD market from up to April 10th. The Nomogram did bind across all the three markets, but just for a few intervals, generally during the peak hours in the evening for this case. For May 11th to May 15th, as shown in the next chart, I had a daily limitation. And this daily limitation was basically distributed across all the hours by ratio of hourly load forecast to the daily load forecast for the southern system. Due to this, the Nomogram limit has a gross load shape as shown in. So when we see that the yellow and the green dotted bars has a more of a gross load shape as the limit because of the daily limitation, as shown in the green and yellow dotted lines. The blue line is basically the average hourly gas burn flow on this Nomogram in the RTD market, and the orange line is basically the IFM hourly gas burn flow on this Nomogram in the IFM market. This Nomogram also was binding in a few intervals across all the days, but especially it was binding, especially in the hours in hour ending 19, 20, and 21, that is the evening peak hours. Similarly, for May 29th to June 12th, the gas Nomogram was enforced due to a maintenance work at the glide compressor station. Again, this Nomogram had, in this instance, it was binding, generally speaking, in the evening peak hours from hour ending 18 to hour ending 21, 22. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. The previous slide shows the hourly gas burn for all the hours whenever when the Nomogram was enforced. Now this slide basically gives you a flavor of it for one sample day. How did it look, and when were the Nomogram binding, and it shows the shadow prices as well in this particular slide. For April 9, it was for April 7 to April 9. I took a sample day of April 9, and it showed that it was a flat curve of 4 mmCF with shadow prices, with the Nomogram binding in the evening peak hour in hour in 20, which is shown in the yellow dotted lines in this particular curve. Similarly, for May 12th and the June 10th, it was binding. It was a daily limitation, which was distributed across an hourly limit by using the ratio of gross hourly load over the daily load forecast, and it was binding generally in the evening peak hours from 20, 21, 22. Sorry. The gas, basically, there has been some discussion previously whether using the gross load shape is the right approach or not. So ISO is now planning to propose some enhancements to the existing gas Nomogram. This gas nomogram capability is currently implemented in the market application. Distribute the daily max gas volume, which is specified by SoCal Gas, to hourly gas maximum gas volumes based on the assigned forecast zone. This methodology needs to be updated with more and more renewables coming online, and the fleet of the resources constantly changing. So now this approach we're planning to change a little bit. We're planning to propose a little bit of changes in this. Because of the current methodology, this results in the nomogram binding in some intervals where the hourly gas volume allocated is lower than necessary because excessive gas volume is allocated to hours when the gas need is less likely. ISO is planning to use a net load approach instead of a gross load approach now, which we think that might better reflect the system conditions and might allocate the gas appropriately. The net load assessment basically would consider the total system load, net of generation by solar and wind resources, which may more closely resemble the actual gas burn requirement. That's what we think. This approach will accurately account for changes that may happen from day to day, since it will be based on the forecasted production of wind and solar resources. Another approach that ISO is also planning to propose is considering the day-ahead plus 2 historical gas burn to shape the limitation profile. So these are the two approaches that ISO is planning to propose. This, when the need arises, basically ISO may assess what shape might fit better for the current system need conditions at that particular hour, at that particular system condition day. In addition, there have been cases, what we have seen in the April case, that the gas system limitation is a fixed profile, it is a fixed curve. So currently there is a lot of manual work that happens behind the scenes to keep it at a fixed value for the gas limitations. And ISO is proposing to enhance these applications and make it more usability. There is also a few usability enhancements needed to provide operations the ability to make adjustments as needed to ensure effective implementation of the gas burn limitation to maintain gas and system reliability. ISO will also conduct its normal Vpm change management process to socialize these changes with the stakeholders. Any questions from the gas constraint?
As a reminder, you can enter the question queue by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. Mickey, will you let us know if anybody enters the queue?
Absolutely. Yep. Ladies and gentlemen, press #2. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted, and then please state your question. Going to our first question. Caller, please go ahead.
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair representing the 6 cities. Is there now, or are you planning to post sort of a written description of the changes that you're considering to the operation of the Nomogram? I really appreciate the explanation, but it went by very quickly, and it would help me a lot to have a written version to sort of be able to study.
Yes, thanks Juan, for the question. Yes, definitely we'll go through the BPM process. We'll make sure that this explanation is put into the BPM and will go through the BPM change management process. Okay,
and any idea when the PRRs for that will become available?
Yeah, this is Guillermo. We're planning this change to take effect on the fall 2020, so we have to make sure that the BPM process aligns very well with the implementation date. So most likely in the neighborhood of 60 days prior to November 1st, we may be able to put the information out so that we can naturally align with the implementation date. So I would say November, October, September, somewhere end of August, you should be able to start seeing the process to kick in.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thanks very much.
Are there any other questions in the queue?
Going to our next question. Caller, please go ahead.
Hi, sorry, this is Bonnie Blair again. Did I somehow stay in or not get?
And there are no more questions for this section. Isabella, back to you.
Okay, thanks, Mickey. Now I'll move on to congestion revenue rights.
Thank you. This is Guillermo. I will cover this section and also the next one about renewable and curtailments. The specific section for congestion revenue rights is really an incremental update to some of the material we introduced in the last May MSC discussion. In that discussion and also in the paper that we published prior to that discussion, we introduced a variety of new metrics to assess the performance of the congestion revenue right market. And this section of the deck really covers some of the key metrics that we have already introduced. This is really to introduce the performance related to April and May. That are the two most recent months that we have assessed. Going to the specific metrics, this one captures the overall settlements of the congestion revenue rights. It has different metrics: the notional value, that means at full funding; the amount of CRR deficit, that is the deficiency that we accrue in the settlements of the CRRs; the CRR clawback, that is a component that we have to put back into the system to achieve revenue neutrality; the amount of CRR payments after the adjustments, that is really the final settlement value that participants holding CRRs are going to observe. And this also has another component because we track that explicitly, and that is the CRR surplus. In addition to CRR deficits, we also accrue surpluses on different constraints through the period reported. This surplus is not netted out with the deficits. Effectively, this goes on its own balancing account that eventually is allocated to measure demand. The balancing account that accounts for this surplus and also accounts for the auction revenues is really the final money that is allocated to measure demand. The key point here is that you may recall the discussion that we had in the previous months that by the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020, we observed large deficiencies accrue mainly on constraints in southern part of the system, the Devers Valley constraint. And as we move out of that condition, you can see that the CRR deficit, specifically the negative bars in blue, start to diminish to the point that in May, you can really see a very small deficiency. Even though the deficiency is pro rata allocated, it is important to ensure that we have as low as possible the CRR deficit, because that still measures and quantifies how much misalignment we may have between the CRR auction and the day-ahead market. The less the deficiency we have to allocate, the better, because in that case, the CRR values that we have to honor remain as close as possible to the nominal, to the full value of the CRR. Next slide, please. This one turns to the auction revenues, and this is broken out by the different components of the auctions. Obviously, we have positive and negative auction revenues, depending if these are buy CRRs or sell CRRs. The grouping that we have introduced here is really the basis to move forward into the calculation of the auction efficiency metrics that we have later on. And the interesting part here, when you analyze, for instance, all the slices and dices of the auction revenues, overall, the dotted line stands for the net auction revenues. That is eventually the final value of dollars that have to go into the balancing account to be allocated to measure demand. When we unpack those auction revenues, between the positives that are typically for buy-auction CRRs that are prevailing CRRs versus the negative auction revenues that are coming from the sale of CRRs, either from auctions or from allocations. You can see the trend, and if you draw an imaginary line between 2018 and 2019, that is when we effectively implemented the policy changes, you can see that that trend doesn't change significantly. We still have quite a meaningful amount of negative auction revenues associated with the sales of allocated CRRs. The elimination of the non-delivered paths really targeted only the portion that is represented by the green bars. The bars in red, light and darker, are really still in place because the sale of CRRs from allocation processes continue to happen before or after the implementation of the policy changes. The only difference now is that with the policy changes, participants with allocated CRRs can explicitly sell the CRRs. Prior to the changes, they have to put a buy bid to a counter flow in order to offset the position that they have because we didn't have the explicit feature for selling CRRs. For the recent 2 months, in the May and June, you can see that the auction revenue is in the neighborhood of $6 million per month. That is, to some extent, comparable to historical values as you go back to 2017 and 2018. Next slide, please. Now, this is the auction efficiency metric that we discussed at length in the paper and also in the MSc discussion. And this captures, in a nutshell, what we call the efficiency between the CRR auction and the day-ahead market. The bars in red stand for the money that the CAISO collects by selling CRRs to any participant that is willing to buy a CRR in the auction, regardless if it is a low-serving entity or a financial trader or a generator. And the bars in blue stand for the value of the CRR, basically the CRR payments, accrue in the day-ahead market after we have applied the pro rata allocation of deficits. And we take the pro rata CRR payments as the reference because effectively this is the dollar value that realizes once the CRRs are settled, given the fact that now we have a partial funding logic. Ideally, we want to see these two bars, the red and blue, coming as close as possible one to the other. And that was one of the ways we measured the efficiency and the concerns that took us to go into this policy effort in the last 2-3 years. And you can see that the lines, the dotted line in purple with the markers, stand for that ratio. A ratio of, let's say, 80% means that a participant purchasing a CRR in the auction is paying 80 cents to get that CRR, and in turn is going to get paid $1 in the day-ahead market when it holds the CRR. It's a ratio of this reference of how much it costs to buy it and how much it revenues gets from settling that CRR. In the last month, you can see that the ratio has been in the neighborhood of 80%. It varies month to month, given the dynamics of each month, given the transition conditions, the configuration changes, and so on. So it's quite dynamic, and that is expected. And there are some months that are worse than others. There are some months that exceed the 100% ratio, meaning participants pay more in the CRR auction to what the CRR was actually worth in the day-ahead market. If we move to the next slide, that summarizes the annual trend. And this only has a comparison with respect to the previous 2 years prior to the policy changes. And prior to the policy changes, this ratio of the auction efficiency really oscillated in the neighborhood of the upper 40%. As we completed the assessment of 2019 and the first months of 2020, you can see that once you account for all the new dynamics that we have in the settlements of CRRs, the auction efficiency really goes to 87% in 2019 and about 80% in the first 5 months of 2020. So it shows that there is a fair improvement in the performance of the CRR markets with regards to this specific metric. Let me pause to see if we have any questions so far.
Again, you can enter the question queue by pressing #2. Mickey, are there any callers in the queue?
Not yet for this section. No questions.
Okay. Next slide, please. There are different angles. You can see the impact of the policy changes on the performance of the CRR. One of the largest changes that we implemented was to move away from the full funding to a partial funding. Effectively, we only pay CRRs up to the dollar value that we collected from the day ahead in the congestion rents. And this is a useful reference to see the effect of implementing that pro rata funding, because this compares with and without the pro rata funding. Effectively, we only have the pro rata funding since 2019, but there is a way we can go back and try to resettle based on having a full funding. And in terms of revenue adequacy, that means how much money we collect in the day-ahead market against how much money we have to pay to CRRs. That is what we stand as revenue adequacy. You can see that for the first 17 months of operations with the policy changes, effectively the revenue adequacy has been neutralized in the order of $155 million. It's the difference between the cumulative of the blue bars and the green bars. Next slide, please. Sorry, I don't know if we move to the next one. I'm having some connectivity issues. Okay. Another area that we have assessed in the performance of the CRR market is beyond the auction efficiency metric, and we are trying to go deeper into understanding why that auction efficiency realizes in the value that we are seeing. And one of the dynamics that we have observed in the CRR market has to do with the activity from load-serving entities. Load-serving entities, by process, are entitled to get allocated CRRs straightforward based on their load-serving obligations, based on historical obligations. And these are free of charge, and they are based generally from the supply to the demand locations that they have to justify. Once that allocated CRRs are being held by the load-serving entity, the load-serving entity, even the financial traders, have two options. One option is to hold that CRR and just wait for the day-ahead market to happen and settle based on the value of the day ahead. And they can utilize that effectively to hedge their exposure to the day-ahead congestion. On the other hand, they may prefer to sell that CRR into one of the options. If they got an allocated CRR in the annual process and the annual allocation, that means they have seasonal CRRs. Those CRRs can be sold in the annual auction, or they can be sold month by month into the monthly auction. It's up to them when they want to sell it. When they are willing to sell a CRR, they effectively have to go and put a bid. It's a sell bid expressing the willingness to sell that CRR at a strike price. If the market determines that there are bids that are going to be taken on, it has to be merit. Basically, it has to cover their price to be able to be sold. And in that sense, the load-serving entities are in full control of what value they put for their CRRs, at what value they are willing to sell the CRR. This trend shows the volume of of low serving entity CRRs being sold. And you can see there is an increasing trend over time. The volume of CRRs being sold in early 2017 was in the range of 1,000 megawatts. As late as May 2020, that has increased over 3,000 megawatts. So it's a gradual and consistent increase of the volume of CRRs being allocated that now are put for sale in the auctions. If we focus for a moment on the dotted line in red, that somehow represents the percentage of successfully selling the CRRs. If you have the reference of the bars in blue, the full bar and the empty bar, the empty bar is really the portion of allocated CRRs that were put for sale, but they were not clear in the auctions. Only the feeding portion of the blue are the ones that were successfully sold in the auction. So when you compare the proportion between the portion sold and the portion not sold, is what you get this dotted trend that is in the neighborhood of 80%. So effectively it means that for all the allocated CRRs put for sale by low serving entities, about 80% of those CRRs are successfully sold into the auctions. And that is quite a successful ratio to say that are sold effectively in the auctions. And actually, our question is going to be, well, that is great, but in comparison to the overall portfolio of the allocated CRRs, how much does that represent? Can we move to the next slide, please? This is the complement metric because it compares in a proportional ratio out of the total volume of the portfolio of allocated CRRs, how much is put for sale in the auctions. And the bars in blue stands for the volume of allocated CRRs as a total, and the dotted trend in red stands for the percentage of that portfolio being sold. And you can see as early as 2017, the proportion or the share of the allocated CRRs being sold was in the range of lower than 4%. As late as 2020, we can see that share of CRRs being sold can be as high as 16%. And that still is a steady and increasing trend of more and more allocated CRRs being put for sale in the auctions. Next slide. Another way we analyze the performance of the CRR has to do with the arbitrage that may happen in the market. Specifically, this is the arbitrage that may realize between the annual auction and the monthly auction. Any participant, once they meet the credit obligations, are able to participate in the annual and the monthly or either one. There is certain type of positions in the market that we have assessed in which a participant comes to the annual auction and buys a CRR. If it has to buy a CRR, it has to pay for that CRR because it's typically in the prevailing direction. Once that participant holds that CRR from the annual auction, it faces the same decision point of a low-serving entity. Does it keep it for settlement in the day-ahead market, or does it sell it in the subsequent auction? And this is a specific dynamic because if somebody buys a CRR in the annual auction, the only opportunity they have to sell it is in the subsequent and corresponding monthly auction. This metric goes about that type of arbitrage, buying something in the annual auction and selling that CRR in the monthly auction. When it buys in the annual auction, it's a cost to buy the CRR. When it goes and sells that CRR in the monthly auction, it's a revenue because now it's going to be able to sell the CRR and is going to represent generally a revenue for the participant. And this is a classical definition of arbitrage, taking advantage of the differences that may happen between the annual and the monthly auction. And we know that differences exist between these two auctions because one is run more than a year in advance of the actual settlement period. The monthly auction is run in 3 weeks, 2 weeks in advance of the actual settlement period. In between, there is a large gap time-wise where things are going to change. So this arbitrage, as you can see in this metric, has been quite profitable, and the arbitrage is no more than the difference between the bars, heights between the green and red bars. And that amounts to the dollars of arbitrage that is happening between the auction. If we take a ratio between these two, we are talking about a ratio of upper 20s as much as 30%. That is relatively low for the expectation that we may have in an efficient auction. Next slide, please. This is the last one, and this is new to the deck. We didn't introduce this specifically in the report or in the MSc discussion at this level of granularity. Another area that we have assessed for the CRR performance has to do in an analogous form to what we did just for the arbitrage of participants between the annual and the monthly auction. This is an area that effectively goes into how well low-serving entities may be undervaluing or overvaluing the allocated CRRs. As indicated earlier, when a low-serving entity gets an allocated CRR, it can keep it and settle that CRR in the day-ahead market, or it has an opportunity to sell it in a subsequent auction. We have seen that low-serving entities are selling a meaningful amount of their volume of allocated CRRs, and the question is how well they are valuing those CRRs. For 2017 and 2018, the trend showed that low-serving entities were undervaluing the CRRs in the range of $31 million between the 2 years. That effectively means that they sold the CRRs for less than what they were worth in the day-ahead market. When we implemented the policy changes effectively in 2019 and 2020, you can see that, very interestingly, this trend has flipped. 2017 and 18, low-serving entities were undervaluing the CRRs. 2019 and 2020 seems to be an overvaluation of CRRs. That means they are selling their CRRs for more than what is worth in the day-ahead market. A factor that plays a role here has to do obviously with the pro rata funding, because now it's harder to assess what the worth of the CRRs are going to be in the day-ahead market, because there is this new dimension of allocating deficits to all the CRRs based on the contributions on the specific constraint. The bars in blue effectively stands for the total CRR payments after we estimate the CRR deficit allocation. I can tell you, prior to 2019, it was very precise, and it can be very accurate how we assess the evaluation of the CRRs being sold in the auctions by low-serving entities. After the policy changes, all what we can aim to have is a good estimate, because we really don't know what the value should be. Simply because once a CRR is sold, it vanished, it's gone, right? Now the capacity is made available to the transmission system, but there is no tracking of what the value of that CRR is in the day-ahead settlement. That CRR no longer exists. So we have to come with some estimates of what would be the notional value, then we can make some approximation of what the pro rata funding, pro rata allocation of the deficit would be, to come with a ballpark value of effectively what would be the final CRR adjusted value in the day-ahead market. So 2019 and 2020 is a rough approximation to give us a sense of where in the range that valuation would be. Still, even though it's an approximation, we believe the trend on its own, that is an overvaluation, would remain. It may be higher or lower value, but the trend is quite straight. And again, this is the only new metric that we have introduced, and it requires some additional assumptions and estimations that we have to put for assessing the value of the CRRs that were sold in the auctions by load-serving entities. I will pause here to see if we have any questions related to CRRs.
As a reminder, you can access the question queue by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad.
Going to our first question. Caller, please go ahead.
Hey, Gary, Mike Kramick with Boston Energy. I just have a question on slide 17. In your annual auction cost to buy, do you include the cost of collateral to hold that position, or are you just looking at strictly the auction price?
This is just gross calculation of costs and revenues based on the face value of the CRR. No time, no value of time, and no additional administrative cost. It's purely gross calculation within the market.
Great. So the actual cost of the annual auction is probably higher than what is shown here, but thank you for the clarification.
You're welcome.
Next question. Caller, please go ahead.
Hi, this is Daniel Chris with California Department of Water Resources. First, I would like to thank you for putting those slides. They're pretty good and pretty accurate, and the data looks very nice. I do have a question. About 2 years ago when we were discussing the Track 1B implementation, I also mentioned the Track 2. So far, at that time, we didn't expect we didn't know what the return is going to be of the Track 1B, 87% for excuse me, for 2019, and for 2020, 83% sounds good. The question is, with those numbers, could we reconsider the global derate factor for the monthly? Is still set to 17.5%, which represent about 75% of the monthly allotment. And since with Track 1B will derate based on the congestion rents collection, I think I don't see the purpose of maintaining the global derate factor for monthly CRR allocation. So what's your take on that, Guillermo?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting question, and thank you for asking that. Yes, you are right that we currently have a process in place that is the global derating factor, in which we basically derate every single element of the transition system in the CRR auction model, such that we can somehow, in a blunt fashion, try to maintain to the level of transition in the auction that potentially is going to realize in the day-ahead market. That was more meaningful when we have the full funding, because really revenue adequacy was one of the key points. Once we have implemented the pro rata funding, it's less obvious if it is needed or not, because by the pro rata funding on its own, we ensure revenue neutrality. I would say there is still merit to that, and let me explain why. One of the reasons is that even though we have the pro rata funding that neutralizes any deficiency that we may have in the system, it's still a healthy process to ensure that we release the transition capacity in the auction that eventually is going to be made available in the day-ahead market. Now, the global derating factor is this blunt instrument that we use because it's generic. It's across the system. Derating one transmission line in the same way that another one that has caused large deficiencies may not be quite efficient and targeted. We are doing some exploration whether we need to be actually more targeted in applying these rates rather than system-wide. But again, in terms of the principle, I think it's important to realize that it's still important to come out of the auction process as close as possible to neutrality so that we don't have to then re-scramble the egg applying this pro rata funding. Yes, the pro rata funding is going to neutralize it no matter what. It's even better to try to not have to rely on that once we have released the CRS, because that is detrimental to the value of the CRS, even though it achieves the revenue neutrality. So there is a space there for improvement in terms of making sure that we can have a more efficient way to apply those rates, maybe more targeted to the constraints that we have historically observed instead of system-wide. That is still open for discussion and assessment.
Okay, thank you very much.
Do we have any other question?
Going to our next question. Caller, please go ahead.
Hi, Guillermo. This is Wei Zhou from ACE. On slide 17, I think this is a very useful information. Can you explain a little bit about the timing and how the modeling could be the same or different between the two auctions, annual and the monthly auctions? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the most obvious case way would be in general when we lock the model for the annual process. I believe that is somewhere in July, August. If we are going to be doing the auction, the allocation process for 2021, that means this July, this August, we're going to be locking that CRR model, right? And at that point in time, we have to take into account any outages that we know that are going to take place. And there may be some outages that we know. But having this, for instance, in July, August 2020, for CRR that are going to have a life term of November, December 2021, we are talking more than a year away, right? So naturally, when we are running that annual auction, we are talking about more than 15 months in advance of having to lock the model for those periods of time. Now, when we come with the monthly auction, let's say for December, we lock the model in July 2020, and for the monthly auction, indeed, we have to do that somewhere in November, right, early November. So we are really talking about 15 months or so of natural time lag for locking the models. In a 15-month period, many things may change. More information naturally is going to be made available for the monthly auction than what was known for the annual auction. So that is the most natural difference that may arise between the annual and the monthly auctions.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there any other questions?
There are no more questions for this section.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's move to the next section then. This is just a recap of the recent trends that we have for curtailments and renewables, because there has been a lot of activity in this area and we have received a lot of questions. And we consistently provide this type of metrics, but I think it's useful to discuss a little bit specifically on what happened in the last months. You can see that back in April, we are typically in the time of the year where we experience the largest amount of curtailments year after year. First is the seasonal effect, that this is the perfect timing and combination of conditions, right? We have relatively low levels of demand combined with ramping up the production of solar and resources. We may have more hydro production, and this is the recipe to have the exposure to more curtailments. That is in addition to the increasing volume and production of renewable resources. The trends that you have here are broken out by either system or local. That means whether it's oversupply or for congestion management, and also broken out by wind and solar. First, you can see that the majority of the curtailments is really about the economic local, meaning we are moving resources down, reducing production of renewable resources due to the need for congestion management. These are resources like any other technology that are effective to handle congestion on certain constraints, and therefore the market finds optimal to deck those resources. And when you see the type of technology, dominantly that is going to happen in the midday hours, and therefore the largest share of the curtailment is going to accrue on the solar resources. That is the dark red portion in the lower plot. That is nothing new. This is the typical seasonality dynamic that we see year after year. Obviously, year after year, we see this only increasing. And next slide, please. We have to put in context the overall curtailments. I think it's important to realize that against the total production that we have in the system. This, again, breaks down the information by either oversupply, that is the system type of curtailment, versus local, that is the one for congestion management. This same trend, when you compare against the total production, gives you the percentage of curtailments relative to the total renewable production. And even though these numbers are quite large, in the range of up to 300 gigawatt hours per month, you can see that, relatively speaking, they have reached levels of up to 5% of the total production. That means so far we have been curtailing renewable production up to 5% of its total capability. And that number is also increasing. You can see that as early as 2014-15, that was below 1%. Now we're consistently growing steadily in the range of 3, 4, up to 5%. Next slide, please. This is a different way to see the information because, as you know, the majority of the curtailments occur in the early months of the year. And something interesting that happened this year is that given the volume of curtailment that we have in basically April, you can see that somewhere by the end of May, we exceeded the 1 million megawatt hour of curtailment. That is quite a mark, and that happened quite early. The other trends just show you how fast they have accrued over the first months of the year. And then when we go into the summer period, they plateau in a nice range because there is not much need for curtailment once we are going through the full ramp of the summer profile. Obviously, it's going to be still higher once we start going into the winter season. We don't know how high it's going to be, but that just tells you how quickly this is accelerating year after year. Next slide, please. This is a new metric that we introduced because we have been getting some questions about what is the typical price at which we are curtailing renewable production. And this is a weighted average aggregated value at the system basis to give you a sense of the price at which the markets are curtailing renewable production. There are 3 components here. One in green, that is for the energy and losses components of the marginal price. The ones in blue stands for the marginal congestion of component. And the full LMP is the dotted red markers. And typically, you're going to expect that when you have very low energy prices, you may have some levels of curtailments. And that is a complete different story when we have congestion that is represented in blue, because congestion may happen not necessarily just in oversupply conditions. Congestion may be at any time of the day, even at the peak hours, as long as there are effective resources, there are renewable resources to do congestion management, they may be decrementally dispatched to help us to do that congestion management. So typically you are going to see that the prices at which system-wide we do the curtailments of the renewable resources is no lower than minus $50 per megawatt hour. Typically they are in the very close neighborhood of the $0. And that may also signal how deep we have to go into the biggest stack, because when we are doing these curtailments, assuming oversupply conditions, we start from the most expensive unit to the cheapest unit. So if this reflects that we are basically just having to reduce supply up to the point where we have to deck the resources with bits relatively to the zero value, that still means that we may have deeper bit stack to still go through, and we may not need to because we have plenty of ramping capability to do it. So that is a good signal that the stack for the incremental dispatches is robust to allow us to not have to run out of that capacity and go into the curtailment of self-schedules. Okay, next slide, please. Just to complement this, I think, as I indicated earlier, this is the time of the year where we see the increase of the curtailments, typically because the compounding effect of having more solar, more wind, together with the run out of river hydro generation. Now, this trend was quite interesting timing-wise because obviously we have these provisions of the shelter in place, the COVID-19. So we got a few questions related to the effect of the COVID-19 on the curtailment level. We know, and Amber and her team are going to discuss in a bit, the effects of the COVID-19 on the load profile. We expect that there was a lower level of demand, and if you have lower levels of demand, naturally you may be in the place where you're going to have potentially more curtailment. That could be a factor, but the timing was interesting because, as you can see in the different trends that we have introduced, in general, the increase of curtailments that we have in this 2020 was not really driven by oversupply. It is a factor like any other year, but the majority of the increase of curtailments is due to congestion management. The local nature of the curtailments is really what drove this quite high. And about 85% of all the curtailments were really due to congestion management. And as you may recall, two different discussions we have had. Late in the year, early in 2019 and early in 2020, we have quite a congestion in the southern part of the system, and that induced a lot of curtailments. Then as we start moving into the springtime, we start having other type of outages in the system, transmission outages, that imply more transmission constraints binding in the market, and these were really more in the northern part of the system. That was still a compounded effect of moving into what we call the summer rating limits for transmission constraints that took effect on April 1st. So when you see on a daily basis how the curtailments have increased over time, you can see a very natural correlation of the curtailments increasing dramatically, effectively, when we move into the summer rating that is more restrictive set of limits for the transmission system, and therefore you may need more need for congestion management, and therefore you may have to deck more resources. And this aligns very naturally with the timing of the shelter-in-place provisions of the COVID-19, and that is why people have these questions whether it was really the driver of all these additional curtailments. Again, there may have been an effect on that, but the main driver was really about the transmission congestion that we have in the system. With that, let me see if we have any open questions at this point before we move to the next section.
Mickey, are there any callers in the queue?
Going to our next question. Caller, please go ahead.
Hi, Guillermo. This is Samia from PG&E, and I think it'd be interesting in future presentations to start a slide or two, if possible, about storage and how storage is operating, whether it's primarily for AS, whether we're seeing shifting, we're seeing more energy shifting with sort of the opposite pattern of the solar. So that's just something to consider for the future when I'm looking at all of these increased curtailments and what solutions there are, obviously, and storage.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very good recommendation. We will take it.
there any other questions?
No further questions right now.
Okay, then I will pass it to Amber, Rebecca, and Michael for the discussion of this topic.
All right. Good morning, everybody. We're going to give a joint presentation on the COVID-19 impacts to the California ISO. So throughout this deck, we have presented some of these components publicly before. I'm sure some of you are aware of some of the slides that have been updated throughout of our backcast analysis. We've incorporated a couple of those in there to talk in this public forum about what we have done. So we'll look at the COVID impacts on the load, some of what is going on behind the scenes with the actual load shapes and things that we're seeing, making it difficult for the load model to form some relationships that it's typically used to. And then we'll dive into the already public available backcast information if you guys have any more questions on that. And then we're going to talk, which is something we haven't talked about in the public setting yet, about forecasting improvements that we've made to the load models for the California ISO and the EIM entities, and then what we're going to do looking ahead as we continue in this COVID-19 space going forward. So I'll be covering some of the backcast sections, what we've run and have public out there already. Michael will be taking the EIM load components, and then Rebecca will be taking the CAISO components as we go through the presentation. Next slide. So an overall summary, the numbers on here are based off the backcast analysis. So for this is for the California ISO system. The first full week of stay-at-home order started on March 20th. During that period of time, we've ran an analysis from March 20th forward. New numbers will be coming out in the next week or two of what we've seen the last couple of weeks. But currently to date, we are seeing average load reductions, megawatt hours, of 3.7% reduction during the weekdays, or 1.4% reduction during the weekends. And we do see on the megawatt impact side up to a 6.7% reduction during the peak hour. That peak hour is typically our morning peak. We do see 6.7% reductions as well in the middle of the day time frames, and you can see that as I go through some of the deck later on where we have hourly numbers by month. When looking at the hourly average load reductions, we're seeing ranges of 0.5% reduction up to 12%. That 12% really was during the time period we didn't have air conditioning or heating loads, so March, April, through the hours of hour ending 7 and through hour ending 18. The forecast team did perform a backcast analysis. I'll get into more details about what that is and the importance of it for the California ISO. And we've continued to improve our models, and we'll talk about that later in the presentation. Even though the models could not have anticipated the human behavior changes that have evolved over the last few months, going into stay-at-home orders and partially out of stay-at-home orders, and in this in-between state that we are in right now. And then finally, end of the presentation, we'll talk about the energy prices. The energy prices have declined about $10 a megawatt hour, and we have a couple slides on that, but there have been no impacts to grid reliability from the stay-at-home order or the COVID-19 evolution. Next slide. I will pass it off to Michael.
All right. Thank you, Amber. Shelter-in-place policies began on or around March 16th, and with that we began to see some new human behavior that was began to impact the CAISO as well as the EIM loads. We noted several impacts, and these varied in different magnitudes or degrees depending on the region, again, in the CAISO load or in the EIMs. Some of these were lower loads, shifting of the peak time, morning profile changes, more notably the ramp rate as we started seeing, new behavior from that stay-at-home order. these new load shapes and the load magnitudes acted as outliers in the model's historical training set, and that started to lead to some forecast degradation. Furthermore, as Amber mentioned a moment ago, this was an evolving situation, and these evolving policies started to further impact different regions and EIM entities depending on the entity and depending on the date. So with that, it created further challenges because now you've got differing human behaviors changing, and those started changing faster than not only the load model can pick up on, but faster than we could look inside the model to assess those relationships. So it was essentially the scenario where we began to chase a moving target. Next slide, please. So this is a graphic from an example EIM entity, and what we're seeing here does a good job of highlighting what I previously just mentioned. So the red line is a COVID-impacted day, whereas the subsequent blue lines above it are historical profiles from those surrounding days across the previous years. So, for example, if the COVID-impacted day is April 15th, the non-COVID load days that span that would be from April 1st to April 30th days across all years in the historical load data that was used to train the model. So those blue lines would be April 1st, 2016, April 1st, 2017, April 1st, 2018, so on and so forth, and then we move on to April 2nd. So again, this graph really highlights the COVID-impacted load actuals that we started seeing. In this particular instance, we can see different ramp rates in the morning, the lower load pull changes, and the peaks and whatnot. So we move on to the next slide to back to Amber to assess the backcast analysis.
Yeah, so as Michael highlighted, you are seeing very different load actual shapes during the COVID-19 stay-at-home orders. That example was during the heart of the stay-at-home orders. The team took a real surgical approach to look at it holistically. We were looking at those shapes by EIM entity, but also wanted to look further into the backcast of what is going on in the load models. We started this backcast analysis to assist us in short-term forecasting, knowing which regions were having the biggest impact, what items we could tune the model to, which models needed to be tuned first, and make sure that we were staying on top of the movement that was occurring with COVID-19. So the biggest question that we've received is, what is a backcast? We've seen a lot of people analyze our load shape of the CAISO system compared to previous years. The California ISO did not take that approach. The reason for that is we were really looking to see which models needed to be evolved and changed. So what we did is we ran a backcast model in the day-ahead time frame just for the California ISO because it is the day-ahead time frame. And for example, yesterday, 6/24, today we would run the numbers of 6/24 of what our expected model is. And the expected model is the model that we were using prior to COVID-19 impacting the system at all against the actuals that are occurring. We would then populate all of the weather information or characteristics that drive that load model. So for 6/24, we'll populate in temperature actuals, humidity actuals, and also behind the meter actuals. So that's important because we're really trying to isolate what we call model error. There's some model error that exists throughout any model that we're running in this backcast state, but this assisted us in isolating COVID-19 model errors, and we'll go through a few graphs and you can see how this evolved. Next slide. So this is a graph looking at the pre-stay-at-home orders of a backcast. The blue line is the expected model outcome, where the
red line is the actual. This is going to be the trend that we saw throughout. I picked just a few slides out of the publicly available deck. If you want to see more of the days, feel free to go and look at that. But this shows that there is some model error that occurs on day-to-day before we ended up in the COVID-19 space. But once we get to that partial stay-at-home line, which is towards the right side of the graph, you're starting to see the impacts much more than what we saw pre-stay-at-home in the orders. You're seeing that the morning peak especially is reduced. The middle of the day is dropping significantly lower, and that was a trend that we saw over time. Next slide. This was really in the heart of stay-at-home for the California ISO, the time period of March 30th through April 12th, before things started opening back up, before we had any heat on the system where air conditioning loads started getting pulled. You saw very evidently more impact on the weekdays than on the weekends. You're also seeing very significantly impacts to the morning peak, some impacts to the evening peak, but really in the middle of the day, you're seeing the loads dip out more than we would have expected during the weather conditions that we were having at that time, as well as the different cloud cover scenarios that we were having during that time, because we are populating the actuals for behind the meter into the model before getting the blue line as well as the temperature. Next slide. This one I like to pull out. The period of May 6th through May 11th was the first significant heat wave that the California ISO observed. During this period of time, we were running 20 degrees above normal across the state, specifically in the coastal areas. During that period of time, we started seeing a change in the behavior that we had seen in the previous slide. So you saw that during those hot days where air conditioning load is starting to be used and utilized, that we're seeing minimal to no impact during the evening peak and the ramp prior to the evening peak. We still saw the most significant reductions to the load being in the morning hours. When I say morning, I'm talking hour ending 6 through 9 and then into the middle of the day a little bit, like hour ending 12. But we do see a different pattern that has been showing itself as we head into heat. We are not at this time forecasting what's going to occur down the line with COVID-19 and how much impact is going to be overall. It's just something that we saw historically, that the COVID-19 situation during air conditioning load doesn't appear to have as significant of an impact on the system. Next slide. This is an overall system impact summary. March 23rd through June 7th is in this data set. This will be updated publicly in the next week or so. Summarizing what we've talked about before, megawatt hours impacted on the weekdays is about 3.7% right now. Weekends are 1.4%. And we see the biggest impacts on an hourly megawatt basis in the morning peak, and then in the next slide, you'll be able to see the impacts on the hourly profiles as well. Next slide. This looks at each week throughout. So week 1 starts with Monday, March 20th, and then goes from there, and how each week has evolved throughout time. But we have seen, the big point is as we've opened up, as heat has come onto the system, we are seeing less percent impact. These are all reductions of megawatt hours in the weekdays as that's occurred. So we're at 1% for week 10, 1.5% for week 11. Next slide. This is one of my favorite graphs. This is showing the different months. So March is green, April is blue, May is pink, and then June is that orangish yellow color. It's showing over time in the analysis how COVID-19 percent difference in the expected load has been and which hours have been the most impacted. You can see throughout this that hour ending 8 is consistently the most impacted. That's the morning peak time period that we were talking about before. And as the heat has returned in the California ISO, how that's changed during that evening peak time period and reduced the impact that we've seen. We still see the heaviest impacts consistently hour ending 8 through hour ending 12. Next slide. I will pass it back to Michael and Rebecca to talk about the forecasting improvements that we've made based off of looking at what the backcast behavior is on the models to make model tuning decisions, as well as the slide that Michael talked about showing the differences between our historically trained actuals.
All right, next slide, please. So we'd like to get into some of the numbers as far as improvements we were able to make off the base models that we were running with prior to the stay-at-home orders. So we forecast, by individual PTO and region. So we really had to take a individualized look at each model to see what interaction might be appropriate, since the stay-at-home orders did, differ by county and by state. The incorporations into the model that took these impacts into effect were staggered as we were figuring out what stay-at-home orders affected each load profile the most. So although these numbers are an overall improvement to CAISO total, I wanted to mention that we did have to, make adjustments to each individual model as the stay-at-home orders affected the state differently. So to take a quick look at the numbers, we were able to find more improvement in our day-ahead metrics as those are further out and more weather-based reactions. We were able to really rely on recent similar days with similar COVID impacts to inform the forecast. As we get further into real time with stack half RTD and RTPD, the models really rely on recent actual load and incorporate that as part of their calculations. So because they're relying on the recent actual load, they're able to kind of shoot off the lowered load numbers we're seeing due to the COVID impact. So for day ahead, we were able to get, a 2% improvement and above for most months. And then as we got further into real time, we were still able to get, 0.5% to 0.2% improvements by incorporating the COVID impacts into the different models by region. Next slide, please. So what this shows is for the hour ahead time frame, the improvement in April and May by hour. So you can really see that we were able to improve that morning hour off of by using the COVID impact model versus the base model. So that's, when we saw the most load reduction, we were able to really tighten that up and bring that forecast error down for those morning hours, as well as some other hours of the day. But the main improvement was that morning load turn. Next slide, please. Now I'll pass it off to Michael to talk about EIM improvement.
Okay. So on the EIM footprint, we did see forecast improvement from the new COVID models compared to the non-COVID base model. So the two graphs at the top there are depicting the load-weighted MAPE of the EIM footprint. Just a quick note, it does not include the CAISO loads. This is strictly just the external entities. The blue line is the base model, and the corresponding horizontal line kind of cut across the graph is the average daily load-weighted MAPE across the month. And then the green line is the COVID models that were worked on, and the green horizontal line is the same metric. So overall, there was an improved forecast accuracy across the month there at the table. So April improved 0.16%, and then May was in 0.13%. The metric there in the parentheses, that is the average, the hourly average improvements for the T60 forecast across the various EIM entities. So that is the hourly average base model MAPE minus the hourly average COVID model MAPE. So April, that spanned between 1.1 to 4.4% by entity. Again, it ranges by entity. May was between 0.3 to 1.9%. May was a warmer time period, and as Amber mentioned earlier, when we had that heat up event, we didn't see quite as much of an impact. So the improvements there and the relationships between the models were a little bit different. And then this slide just kind of shows an example of the improvements that were made. So on the left is the CAISO example, and then on the right is the EIM example. This graph does two things. It highlights the accuracy degradation in the base model, primarily in the morning ramp and morning turn periods, as well as the peak time frame. And it also highlights where the model adjustments were made to account for those changes in COVID. So in the CAISO example, you can really see the morning turn period was adjusted, and on the EIM example, you see that that ramp rate has been sort of accounted for, as well as the peak time frames too. So we do see improvement in the new models. Again, it differs by entity. So, yep. I'll pass it to Rebecca for the CAISO.
So this is, one of our typical graphs we include in MPPF, just showing the monthly accuracy for 2020 compared to previous years. So we are seeing, the increased error for this year in March, April, May, due to, the COVID impacts and the stay-at-home orders. So this just kind of summarizes, everything that we've just addressed, that the accuracy for recent months was increased, or the error for recent months was increased due to the change in the load shape.
And here are the T60 accuracy metrics for each EIM entity. As Rebecca mentioned, we do see that forecast degrading impact across all of the EIMs. We are aware of the forecast degradation, and so we've worked to improve every EIM model, and we are implementing those into production. But it is something we'll continue to keep an eye on as we move further through our summer operation period. And,
all right. Thank you, Michael and Rebecca. At this time, before we go into the price impact for COVID-19, I want to open it up for any questions that you have on the analysis of load.
As a reminder, you can enter the question queue by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. Mickey, are there any questions in the queue?
Going to our next question. Caller, please go ahead.
Hi, this is Ramon Mitchell from Pacific Corp. I have a question on your slide number 41. You presented two examples, the CAISO example and an EIM entity example, but there are no axis labels, and I'm not sure what time period that is, so I'm curious what the time period and the axes are.
So for the time period on the x-axis, that is it's midnight to midnight, and the y-axis were removed for to reveal the entity in which it was.
I see. And for the midnight to midnight, is that one specific day or an aggregate of multiple days?
This is one specific day.
Okay. Thank you.
Is there any other questions?
No further questions for this section.
Thank you, Mickey.
All right. Thank you. I will pass it off to Guillermo for price impact, and prior to doing so, we will be continuing to update the load impact presentation that is posted publicly on the CAISO website for the CAISO backcast information. So you will be able to see more information there the last few weeks within the coming week. Thank you. Guillermo?
Thank you, Amber. Next slide, please. Okay, we wanted to cover somehow prices when we assess the impacts of the COVID-19 provisions. Unlike the forecasting where the conditions exist to be able to do this backcast, for prices or the market in general is more challenging because it's not isolated to one single driver, that in this case would be the accuracy or the weather. So it's just not feasible to try to do a backcast of prices and have the confidence that it's going to be accurate. Given those limitations, what we simply did was to compare two references before and after the implementation of the provisions. And the before was the first 2 weeks of March effectively, and the after is anything after March 19. Having the reference of the before is because they were, relatively speaking, similar conditions weather-wise, load-wise, and so on. And we can see that effectively with the provisions of shelter in place, the load reduced, the prices reduced. Overall, week after week, we saw, generally speaking, a reduction of $10 difference between the before and after conditions. And again, this is a very simplistic approach of comparing just before and after, taking everything is fixed. We just simply cannot go and try to do a backcast of what the prices would be because IFM prices, for instance, are based on bidding demand. And bidding demand may be strategy, may be limitations on the forecast. There may be other exogenous conditions that we cannot just replicate. So trying to come with this type of forecasting back of the envelope analysis could be no more than a fertile exercise to try to come with those prices. That is the reason we came with this simplistic approach. And as the summer started to kick in and we can see the load growing to typical transition months in the end of May, we can see that the price starts to pick up to relatively the same levels before the COVID-19. That is mainly driven just because of the load increase rather than because of changes on the COVID-19 provisions. Next slide, please. Next one. Okay. And this is just the rolling average, the 7-day rolling average of prices for the FMM, the 15-minute market, and the day-ahead market. And you can see the fair decline of prices around the second half of March that coincides with the COVID-19. Again, there are no other way to isolate the effects of the COVID-19 with respect to any other dynamics that we have in the market. And the complexity is really about the dynamics, right? The day ahead depends on many other exogenous variables, virtual bidding, bidding demand. The real time is going to be largely influenced by how well the market was positioned with respect to the real time from the day ahead. So it's just not feasible. And this is just as much as we did to assess the impact on the market side. This is really the end of what we have prepared for discussion this morning. As indicated earlier today, we have other slides that we have as typical part of the deck, but unless you have specific questions, we will not go through each of those. So I would like to open up the forum for any questions that participants may have about any of the topics that we have covered before we move into the policy topic.
Mickey, will you let us know if any callers enter the queue?
I will. Again, to ask a question, press #2.
No questions?
Are there any questions?
And going to our next question, caller, please go ahead.
Hi, it's Ramon Mitchell from Pacific Corp again. I just had one general comment, and I suppose you'd consider it a request to make as well. And this goes back to that slide 41 I was speaking to. It really is an interesting slide in that it shows whereas typically your metrics usually focus on mean absolute percentage error. This slide actually shows the megawatt error. I'm assuming that the y-axis is megawatts. It does seem appropriate that it would be. And I would request that more examples of this in the context of forecast error, because at Pacific Corp we've observed that for our entity forecasts that are public on Oasis, the forecasts are biased towards over forecasting. It is rare to find a situation in which the actuals are above the hour ahead forecasts. And so while the mean absolute percentage errors may be low, the absolute percentage errors show a bias. And it's something that I've not noticed you as the CAISO have presented on from that perspective, especially as it concerns the EIM entities, which have to go through the resource efficiency tests, which are based on these hour ahead forecasts.
Thank you for, this is Amber, thank you for that comment. It's something that we can look at the biased information that's going out and then make recommendations based off of that. The one thing that I will say that we saw as a trend, especially in this COVID-19 system, because of the graph that Michael showed where all of your historical actuals for many of the entities were exceptionally higher than what we were observing in the COVID-19 actual situation. The bias is apparently high because the models are trained off of that historical data set. That's where the model improvements were coming from, is being able to add identifiers and assist in bringing that down, because the actuals have been and shown lower in COVID-19 than they were on the higher earlier previous years. So I'm not surprised that you would see, especially the last couple of months, a systematic high bias. But that is something we watch internally to the CAISO, and that is something we can present more information on if that's helpful.
Yes, thank you very much for that feedback. And I would clarify that I looked at the past 12 months to kind of see on Oasis for the public forecasts, not just post-COVID but pre-COVID, and the pre-COVID forecasts exhibit the same pattern that I noted in terms of bias.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions?
No further questions on the phone right now.
Okay, thank you so much. And I think we are done with this first part of the market update.
Okay. Thank you, Guillermo. Now we'll move into our policy update from John Gooden and Brad Cooper, and I believe Brad Cooper is going to start us off here. So Brad, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Just trying to get my phone off of mute. Next slide, please. I'll start this off with updates to our annual plan and then turn it over to John. He'll go over our infrastructure policy initiatives, then he'll give it back to me and I'll go over the market design initiatives. The 2020 annual plan, we developed at the beginning of the year. We develop every year an annual plan and a 3-year roadmap. And about a year ago, we started providing updates to the annual plan throughout the year. We've made a couple minor updates. The Order 831 import bidding and market parameters initiative has been extended a little bit. We're going to revise our draft final proposal. I'll talk about that when we get to that initiative in the upcoming slides. Then the real-time settlement review initiative has slipped a little. It was originally scheduled to start this spring, but with the COVID-related work situation, things slipped a little bit, and nevertheless, we plan to start that up in July, and I'll talk more about this coming up. In the middle here, we have a potential initiative, CRR analysis. We presented some information on the CRR analysis recently at an MSC meeting, and we show a decision point here for potentially starting an initiative addressing CRR auction efficiency. That was a placeholder in case we felt like we needed to make further modifications to those that we made a couple years ago to the CRR auction and the way CRRs are settled in the day-ahead market. At this point, we don't see any need to make further changes. The auction efficiency has improved significantly. We will be making a related change that's more of a market modeling change having to do with the shift factor threshold for clearing or scheduling load aggregation points. That will be an effort starting up over the next month or so, I believe. And so that's it for the updates to the plan. Everything else has stayed the same. So next slide, please. Okay, so yeah, I'll turn it over to John here.
All right. Thank you, Brad. And good morning, everybody. Again, this is John Gooden. I'll be talking about the key initiatives that my team is working on in the Infrastructure and Regulatory Policy Group. What I'm going to do is I'll walk through my few slides here, providing a brief overview on my team's initiatives, and then I'll open it up for questions, and then I'll hand it off to Brad. So let's start off with energy storage and distributed energy resources, phase 4. So those that have been paying attention to this know that this has been going on for quite some time. This initiative and continual enhancements, again, to energy storage and DER resource models and market rules, again, trying to lower barriers for the participation of storage and DERs. This particular phase, phase 4, really had 4 key components. One, we had our effective load carrying capability study that E3 did for us to try to better inform what the value of demand response is, given its use and availability's limited nature and the fact that it is a variable resource in most cases. So we wanted to understand better how we can reflect the value of those resources different than just, as a capacity value for the peak day in August. We also are going to, we proposed an end of hour state of charge parameter, default energy bids for storage, and then a max runtime, daily runtime parameter for demand response. Again, something that's been asked by the community, DR community, for some time. So those are the 4 key elements. We also are doing some cleanup on the agreements for distributed resources. And that's, again, sort of a secondary issue, but that is part of ESDR. We're trying to simplify that process of how you sign the agreements to participate. Let's see, EIM governing, board has an advisory role. This is not a specific change to EIM balancing authority and their participation, but it's a general market change that we're making. So it's an advisory role for the governing body. Let's talk about status of this initiative. We plan to post the draft tariff on July 21st, and then going to September board, EIM governing board briefing on the 19th, and then the actual ISO board decision on September 30th on these elements. And the plan is to implement these in fall of 2021. I forgot to mention that the lead for this initiative is Jill Powers. So if you have any specific or detailed questions about any of these items, feel free to reach out to Jill. Next slide. I don't know how that stayed in there. Next slide, please. That was a draft earlier version. Okay, so we are doing some tariff clarifications on a couple of proxy demand resource items. So one has to do with how we classify PDR for effective flexible capacity. We used to default to 5-minute dispatchable, and this clarification will make them default hourly. They can request 5-minute dispatchable if a DR is capable of that, but that default to 5-minute was not appropriate. So we're just doing a little cleanup on that. The second element is the slow demand response, and how we're going to operationalize slow DR so it can count as local RA, implementing a pre-contingency dispatch methodology. There's some settlement issues, some minor settlement issue or exceptional dispatch issues, and then how we settle those that we're doing a little cleanup in the tariff. We'll be bringing that to the July board meeting, those little tariff modifications. But all in all, I think this has been a good development, getting this methodology ready and prepared, and plan to implement that at the end of the year. Again, no EIM governing body role in this particular, since these issues have to do with resource adequacy. Let's see, next slide, please. Okay, another big initiative that Gabe Murtaugh is the lead for this. Feel free to reach out to him for specific questions. But the scope is this initiative is really enhancements we're making to hybridized generation and how we model and operate these resources. Again, hybridized is something like where you combine a solar facility with a storage device, is what we mean. There's really 2 phases to this particular initiative. First phase has to do with what we call co-located resources, where behind a point of interconnection you have really 2 distinct resources with their own resource IDs, say the solar facility and the storage, yet they do operate in a coordinated fashion even though they look like they're independent. But for those co-located hybrid resources, we're developing and going to be implementing an aggregate capability constraint. That means that the two combined can't exceed the point of interconnection constraint or limits. So that's phase one, and that's, again, going to the board here in July as well, that phase one. Phase two is a continuation of this initiative where we're, again, just exploring further capabilities to our hybrid resource model. That is where you have both a solar, say, and a storage device operating together as a single resource. And then also some further refinements on the co-located type of hybrids with AS participation, looking at forecasting issues, dynamic limits. There's several things that are ongoing in phase two. Let's see, EIM governing body advisory role on this, again, kind of like on ESDR, is that we're not making specific changes to EIM, but general market changes, so their role is advisory. Okay, as far as status, like I said, go back one. I want to just capture this to reemphasize the two phases. We have EIM governing body briefing as that advisory role on the 30th this month, and then a board decision on that phase one later in July. And then the whole package of the hybrid initiative, the plan is to take that to the EIM and ISO board in November. Okay, now we can move forward. CCE 3 tariff clarifications. Again, we're just waiting for FERC on this. Again, we can move forward on this slide, but that's all wrapped up and waiting for clarification. Resource adequacy enhancements. Again, this has been ongoing for those that have been following it. This is considering reforms needed to the ISO's resource adequacy rules and requirements and processes to ensure the future reliability and operability of the grid. Again, this is trying to work in coordination, collaboration with the PUC to make sure their rules and our tariff stay coordinated as much as possible, and that we're evolving the ROE market to keep it relevant as the grid transforms. Given that this is resource adequacy, there is no EIM governing body role. As far as status, the 5th revised straw proposal, planning to post that week after next. So we are putting the finishing touches on that paper, and we'll be releasing that soon. We have our stakeholder meeting coming up on the 5th revised straw proposal on July 14th. In that time frame, in the 14th or 16th, we'll have that stakeholder meeting, and then the idea is to get another draft final proposal done later this year and then get this to the board in the first quarter of 2021. I think that's it. Do we have any other slides, Isabella? Okay, so this is where Brad takes over. So I will pause here and I will open it up for any questions on my team's initiatives.
Again, you can enter the question queue by pressing #2. Are there any questions for John?
All right, let's turn it over to Brad.
Okay, so the first three initiatives I'm going to go over, flexible ramping product enhancements and day-ahead market enhancements and extended day-ahead market, are all somewhat related. The flexible ramping products enhancements has been addressing various issues with the flexible ramping product. Primarily, the main focus is on the deliverability. We did the price performance analysis a year or two ago, and we found that a good portion of flexible ramping product is not deliverable because we don't model it locationally, and the market will buy it behind constraints because that turns out to be the cheapest place to buy it. So we're addressing that in two ways. We're doing Vpm changes that would go into place this fall, having to do with setting minimum requirements for the various BAAs in the EIM, and that's just a very high-level kind of temporary fix. The more comprehensive modifications have to do with modeling and pricing flexible ramping product nodally. Those are planned to go into place next year in fall 2021. We've outlined all that in our draft final proposal that was recently posted, well, fairly recently posted, May 5th. This is a change that's generally applicable to the real-time market, so the EIM governing body would have an advisory role, and we plan to bring this to the EIM governing body and then the ISO board this coming November. And I should note this slide still lists the eligibility to provide. That had to do with making the default setting for PDR hourly, not 5 minutes. There was an issue with a lot of PDR was listed as 5-minute dispatchable when it actually wasn't. That we actually moved into the PDR initiative that John described earlier. And these flexible ramping product changes are important. Let's move to the next slide. Because in the day-ahead market enhancements, a big part of the scope is a day-ahead and balance reserve product, which effectively is much like a day-ahead flexible ramping product. So we felt it was important, it is important to resolve the deliverability concerns of the flexible ramping product before moving forward with this day-ahead and balance reserve product. And then the day-ahead market is also looking at co-optimizing supply to meet cleared demand as well as the supply that's currently procured in the separate RUC process. The EIM governing body charter currently specifies that the EIM governing body only have an advisory role for, or has an advisory role for only changes that affect real-time market rules. But because this day-ahead market enhancements is foundational to the initiative extending the day-ahead market to the EIM, management will request that the CalISO Board of Governors give the EIM governing body an advisory role over this initiative, not just the parts that might affect the real-time market. We recently had stakeholder calls on our revised straw proposal. We did a fairly significant change to the base formulation of the day-ahead market. The comments are due coming up on July 6th. And we plan to bring this to the EIM governing body and the ISO board mid-next year. Next slide, please. Then finally, the extended day-ahead market, which is looking at extending the day-ahead market to EIM entities. As the slide shows, we're tackling this in what we're calling bundles. We're currently working on Bundle 1, which is looking at transmission provision, resource efficiency evaluation, and distribution of congestion rents. The EIM governing body, similar to the day-ahead market initiative, under the charter, under routine circumstances, they just have an advisory role for parts that might affect the real-time market. But obviously, this is very integral to the EIM, so we plan to request that the CalISO board grant the EIM governing body joint approval authority over the entire initiative. We're working now on the straw proposal we plan to post that sometime in July. I don't want to give a mid date because we're not entirely certain. It will likely be mid-July. Potentially we'll get it out earlier. We're working on it as hard as we can. Same as the day-ahead market enhancements, we plan to bring this to the EIM governing body and the ISO board in mid-next year. And people can contact Don Trethaway for more information about these initiatives, these last three initiatives. FERC Order 831, import bidding and market parameters. This is looking at a cost verification methodology for import bids greater than $1,000. It's also my slide got messed up a little bit here. This ISO market constraint relaxation prices shouldn't be a sub-bullet. That's the other major scope item in this initiative. So there's two scope items: the cost verification for import bids above $1,000, and then looking at the ISO market constraint relaxation prices when we do have bids above in the market. In the event we would have bids in the market above $1,000, which would only occur if costs actually could justify a bid that high, then we would adjust the market parameters based off a $2,000 penalty price. And this initiative is looking at alternatives to setting prices when we got to relax the power balance constraints. It's looking at alternatives to set them at a different price rather than $2,000. We put out our draft final proposal in April and then discussed it at the MSC meeting, and the MSC had some concerns about our proposal. We're working on a revision to that, which we plan to post July 14th. We'll also make a little tweak to the cost verification for import bids part, mostly to sync that up with things we're proposing in the system market power initiative. So we're going to come up with our proposal on revised draft final proposal on July 14th. Then after that, we'll work on tariff and business requirements, and then plan to bring this to the September EM governing body and the September. We're not sure what date we're going to have the public meeting. It'll either be September 30th or October 1st that we'll bring it to the ISO board for their decision. The EIM governing body has an advisory role for this because these are changes that are generally applicable to the ISO market. Next slide, please. System market power mitigation is developing system-level market power mitigation for the real-time market for the CAISO balancing authority area. Although this is focused on the CAISO balancing authority area, the EIM governing body would have an advisory role because it does have an effect generally on the real-time market. We recently posted our draft final proposal, had a stakeholder call on that yesterday. Comments are due July 18th. And subsequent to that, we'll be working on tariff business requirements. And I meant to mention, and we've said this before, but just so people remember, we've revised our process somewhat in that we used to finish the draft final proposal, bring things to the board, then work on tariff and business requirements, which didn't always work out so well because we get into the detailed tariff and the business requirements and realize that there's something we should have done differently, and we'd have to make little modifications, and we'd have to debate whether that was consistent with what the board approved. So we think it's better to vet everything, flesh it out completely, then bring it to the board and that way we can ensure we make any modifications before bringing it to the board. Next slide, please. Variable O&M cost review. Oh, and I should say for the FERC Order 831, import bidding and market parameters, that's Brittany Bean or Danielle Table. They're both handling parts of this, so you can get with them for any questions. Perry Servideo was leading the System Market Power Mitigation Initiative, and he still is, except he is out for maternity leave. He had a baby a few weeks ago, so you get hold of Danielle also for questions about that initiative. The variable O&M cost review, that's looking at updates to the CalISIS calculation of the O&M costs that go into the various default bids that we calculate and commitment cost bid caps. Again, this is generally applicable to the markets. The EM governing body would have an advisory role. We have a draft final proposal coming out in August, and this one is planned to go to the November EM governing body meeting and the November board meeting. And Kevin Head is heading that initiative up. And finally, the real-time settlement review. So this is an initiative that will be starting up soon. This came about as a result of an EIM settlement issue that we found last summer, so we committed to go review the real-time settlement charges to ensure the allocation of charges or the design of the charges is consistent with cost allocation principles. In the meantime, we've identified another issue associated with the settlement of wheeling transactions in the EIM. So what we plan to do is come out with a issue paper and straw proposal in the next few weeks. The issue paper will lay out our plan for analyses to review these settlement charges. Then we want to get stakeholder feedback on our proposed analyses and see if they have any other suggestions for what we should look at. And then it's also going to propose a proposed solution to this identified EIM settlement issue, which we think is relatively straightforward. We want to address this settlement issue in a timely manner, so we'll peel that off from the initiative and take it to the November 4th EIM governing body and the November ISO board decision. This says EIM governing body advisory role TBD. Actually, we think that this EIM settlement, wheeling settlement issue will most likely be primary approval authority for the EIM governing body. I say most likely because we haven't fully analyzed it, but the initial take, it looks like, you know, it involves the EIM settlement of the EIM wheel, so more than likely it comes under the EIM governing body's primary approval role. Although any other issues we address later after or that we identify and that we would have to address after we do this broader analysis, you know, we don't know what the EIM governing body role would be until we identify the issue and look at the situation. And so that's, and James Frederick in the policy group will be heading that initiative. And that completes all the initiatives, and we can open it up for questions.
Nikki, will you let us know if any callers enter the queue?
Yep. Again, to ask a question, press #2. Going to our next question, caller, please go ahead.
Hi, Brad. It's Callie Wells with WPTF. Couple questions on the extended day-ahead market slide you have. So I just want to confirm the Q2 2021 ISO board, that is just taking the bundle 1 proposal? Is my understanding correct on that?
Yeah. That's probably a mistake on there because it should have said decisions. I believe our plan. I believe our plan is to once we complete the bundles to brief the board. My memory's failing me. I believe we would get a decision on the whole thing when it's done, and we would just brief. So yeah, that likely should just say briefings. And just before we went to your questions, I realized I forgot to mention something. So we've been looking at our implementation schedules, and we've rescheduled the implementation dates that we've previously come out with. So, like I said, the flexible ramping product is kind of foundational to the day-ahead market enhancements for the imbalance reserve, and the day-ahead market enhancements is foundational for the extended day-ahead market. So like I said, the flexible ramping product, the nodal modeling and improvements to the flexible ramping product, like I said, that's planned for 2021 implementation. And, based on both workload for everybody, us and stakeholders, and also to give us a chance to put the flexible ramping product in the market for a little bit before then we put the day-ahead market enhancements with the imbalance reserve product. We're now planning on 2022 implementation for the day-ahead market enhancements, and then we would follow that up with 2023 implementation of the EDAM for 2024 onboarding. I should have mentioned that when I went over those slides.
Okay, I appreciate that. Yeah, I was going to be actually quite impressed if you guys were planning on taking the entire EDAM policy to the Q2 2021 for board decision, seeing that I think bundle 3 starts at that point in time.
I believe our plan is, we're not going to have the whole thing done. I don't believe we're going to take these things separately. I think that should say briefings.
Briefing for the bundle 1.
Yeah.
Okay. And then my other question I had is yesterday on the system market power call, you had mentioned that initially you guys were thinking of adding a scarcity pricing initiative to the catalog, but then after thought, you guys have now decided to move that topic into bundle 3 of extended day ahead. So is that one of the other items under bundle 3 will now be scarcity pricing?
Yes, that's one of the topics under price formation listed there. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I guess my only comment on that would be that I think it would make more sense to have it separate, just because, especially now with the 2023 implementation, assuming all goes as planned with EDAM, I guess we're concerned that it might just kind of get lost. And that this is extended day ahead, is focused on the day ahead where scarcity pricing, is also real time. So I guess our comment on that would be, if you guys would reconsider maybe pull that out of extended day ahead and have it as a separate policy in the catalog. But I wanted to kind of reconcile that comment you made yesterday and making sure that your plan was to have it here in EDAM.
Yeah, our plan is to have it here. In a couple months, few months, we're going to be coming out with the roadmap for next year, and I'll bring back the comment, but be sure to bring that up. That would be an opportunity to talk about that.
Okay, yeah. I guess the IRS would be to have it not an EDAM and pulled out separately, kind of like your original plan. But okay, thank you. That's all I had.
Okay.
Are there any other questions?
Going to our next question. Caller, please go ahead.
Hi, Brad. This is Wei Zhou from MSC. I have a quick clarified question on system market power mitigation regarding the comments due date. I think that's on the slide 94. Yeah, I see July 8th, but I see a different day on CAISO calendar and also on the paper or presentation yesterday. Can you confirm which is the comments due date? Because I think in the paper it says, I think it's 14th.
That's whatever is in the paper is correct. I must have missed that on the slide. I think it's what happened was we put out that paper like a week later than we originally scheduled. I just probably missed revising this on the slide. So go with what's in the paper, and that should be the same as what was in our presentation from yesterday.
Okay, so there's no change on the comments due date. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's probably. I just missed it revising the slide.
Okay, thank you.
It's no matter how hard you try, it's hard to get all the dates straight on the slides.
No further questions for this section.
Okay. Thanks, Brad. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you.
Now we'll move into our release plan update from Adrian Chiosi. So, Adrian, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Isabella. Okay. Looks like we're diving right in. Before I go to this training, I want to say that the current set of updates you have on the release planning for us and release execution from us is that it's very similar to what you've seen on the 16 on the release user group meeting. And also to let everyone know that because we have this Thursday, this update, we have canceled the RUG on Tuesday because we feel it's too close and we wouldn't have that many or we wouldn't have updates at all by next Tuesday, hopefully. So I guess the following release user group after this one will be on the 7th of July. It's after the holiday. All right. So first update on slide 98. This is our training program. And usually Rachel or Cindy provide us this update. I'll speak for it. I think Rachel mentioned last time about this July 9 webinar, about the training workshop from August. When it comes to the release content, I think most of the training sessions have been planned and we have target dates for those. I think some of them have been already executed. So the training program is going well. I think you'll find a lot of information on our public site, which you find at the bottom of the page here regarding all the training sessions for all the projects that we have on this fall release and beyond that. Go to the next page. Right, slides 99 and 100 contain summaries for the content of all the releases we have planned. On 99, you will see the year 2020, this year. And we have done some organization, I guess, in this slide, just to show you that in the independent 2020, we have an Aliso Canyon, which previously was shown the fall, and I'll talk to you why this one has moved to independent. And I think I promised you in the prior RUG call that I would add a slide on the slow demand response. And since we had Brad, or I think John, priming the update with the policy that they explained earlier. So I'll get to that. I have a slide for that. When it comes to the fall of 2020, our plans remain on the same timeline, but we will have activation on different dates. As you know, the commitment cost enhancement tariff clarification, I mentioned at the last drug meeting, we plan to have it retroactive on July 1st, while the project will be implemented with a fall release October 1st. Then on the October 1st, we have a set of 5 projects that will be deployed and activated on October 1st. Now, we split a set of projects, the ADS replacement, dispatch operating target, and intertie deviation settlements, to be activated on November 4th. The reason for that is it will become apparent after we discuss the ADS project, but just previewing the explanation I'll give you later is that we plan to give you longer time for parallel operation on this ADS product, and because of that, the implementation timeline for ADS is being extended by 1 month to benefit you this way for a longer parallel operations practice. The dispatch operating target and intertie deviation settlement projects have ADS components, and because the ADS is coming on November 4th, those 2 projects were basically forced to follow the same timeline just because the ADS components is included in an ADS replacement project. Otherwise, those projects have been probably kept on October 1st. But that's the content of November 4th. And as we communicated previously, we have 2 projects that will be implemented in the fall release October 1st, completed by October 1st, and complete the market simulation on that timeline. But will be activated on January 1st. And those 2 projects, we decided for that activation some time ago based on requests from you, from market participants, on when to start those 2 projects. So that's the summary for plans for this year. Let's move to the next slide. This hasn't changed, and I think I followed what Brad and John were saying earlier. I don't think we have these discrepancies. The only thing I would point to you, since Brad said it earlier, is that this last section TBD, he mentioned that the day-ahead market enhancements will happen in 2022 and extend day-ahead market enhancements that will be in the 2023. I think for the commitment cost and default energy bids, most likely this will happen in 2022. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, we go to the next section, Independent Projects 2020. The first is the Nodal Pricing Model Advisory Service for Pacific Corp. We have introduced this months ago. Nothing new on this one. Is the same plan. I posted the links where you can follow up. You know, you can understand the background of this. We added some explanations here. So if you have any questions regarding the project or interested in this topic, let us know by logging a city ticket. Let's move to the next slide. Aliso Canyon, phase 5. I think Aliso Canyon was shown previously as a full release. What happens with this one is that a component of the development for this one is it's kind of a complex development, and based on our conversation with our vendor on this one, it doesn't look like the development part of the project can keep up with the full release timeline. So we moved the project as independent. As you see, we're targeting an implementation date of November 4th, which is the same like one of the batches coming in the fall release. But as you can also see here in red, I draw your attention to the market simulation window, which is starting late, just because the development comes late and we have to do internal testing and confirm the functionality. And the earliest that we anticipate we can open it for you for testing September. Give you, several weeks to test it, and then we plan to deploy November 4th. That's our plan. That's our recommendations. Please provide feedback to city tickets in case you see a problem with this proposed timeline. Slow demand response. So as I said earlier, I think John Gooden introduced this through the policy, the PDR and RA tariff policy clarification. I think it's called that policy initiative. So someone noticed previously that in one of our technical specification, we mentioned slow demand flag in master file. And I want to be fully transparent with you about what it is, and I'm adding all this content on this slide of what that flag will do. For now, I think it's being deployed as with only a null version, read-only null version. But as soon as this policy kind of takes place, completes, and we get board approval and we publish all the BPMs necessary for this to take place, then the flag will become active and it will show you the designation of some demand response resources. I'm also posting here an excerpt from our market instruments BPM that may not have been posted already, but this is what you will see when this is being posted about the criteria that will be used to define a slow demand resource. So hopefully this is helping and answering the questions that we received from you previously in the RUG calls. Okay, moving to the fall release of 2020. Slide 106 is dedicated to a summary of all the major milestones and deliverables that we have for the fall release projects. And I think we reordered those projects in the same order that you see in that summary page. Some changes have been posted in red, and those changes are, looks like our legal department has moved the date for tariff filing now on July 6th. And I'll discuss that when we get to the project slides. Then EIM Enhancements 2020, the technical specification for one of the services for one of the reports that initially we thought we can publish by the end of this week has been moved to July 2nd, next week. And then in red also you see that target date for those 3 fall release projects, ADS, DOT, and intersite deviation settlements, again, all of them with ADS components, to November 4th. The reason is November 4th, I think initially we thought it's going to be November 1st. Then we realized that November 1st is the daylight savings time date, which complicates things, and we don't want to do that. We're going to move it out of that. November 3rd is an election day, so we felt like a good compromise with all those events happening in that timeline would be November 4th. So again, please provide feedback on this proposed implementation date. Okay, moving to the timeline, the market simulation overview. I think you have seen all the structure simulations. We have been posting those, and I think we expect some feedback from you by the end of the month on all those structure scenarios. And I think July 3rd is an important date. It's a deadline to register for participation in market simulation and again to provide feedback on the proposed structured market simulation scenarios. And we're also showing code implementation on an environment setup with environment closures on July 6th, 13th, and 20th, when we probably start deploying the entire code in anticipation of the market simulation. I understand from Frank that we plan also to post an implementation plan for the release in early August, probably. That will detail, the full steps and process that will take place in anticipation of that October 1st deployment. We have also, this one is good too. At the bottom of the page, you see hyperlinks. This presentation will be posted as a PDF, but in that PDF, you will have hyperlinks to the market simulation plan and market simulation calendar. I don't think we had those last time in the last truck, so those are the links that you can use to find the market simulation plan and market simulation settlements calendar for the fall release. Okay. For the events, I guess, and the steps involved in market simulation execution, the first 2 weeks, 7/27 and 8/3, are dedicated for connectivity. And I think I mentioned previously, we plan to use those 2 weeks internally to rehearse the execution of the structure scenarios. Then we start with the structure scenarios during the weeks of 8/10 and 8/17 for all the fall release projects. The only exception is the market settlements timeline transformation, which it looks like we're only going to be ready for that to start executing the structure scenarios for that project the week of 8/24 and 8/31. And because of that, you will see in the project update that we plan to, for this particular project, we plan to extend the support of the market simulation until middle of September, just because of some recalcs and statements are coming probably in the September timeline. Okay, let's move to the next slide. A summary of all the system impacts for all the fall release projects. This should be familiar to you. Nothing new here. Let's move to the next one. Vpm Impacts. Again, we presented this previously. Let's go to the next slide, please. All right. We're moving to a section of the presentation that is duplicated into our technical user group, which took place on Tuesday. So I think those, again, have been presented to you for quite some time ago. There are no changes, and I'll take questions later, but at this point I have no changes or news to you regarding those interfaces. This is CCDB and LMPM. Next is the integrate interface changes for ADS, DRS, and MRIS. Again, no changes on this one compared to our previous updates. Let's move on. The last one is the master file, and this is the last line there on the table is the one that I addressed with the slow DR slide that I had earlier. Okay, that's the interface changes. Looks like we have posted for CMRI and Oasis. I mean, this was previously there, but for the CMRI, that available balance capacity, also known as ABC reports in CMRI, now is coming a week later on 7/2, and includes some updates on the EIM feasibility and load conforming data. First update for the CC tariff clarification. This is the content that shows you the system impacts, PPM changes, tariff changes, and a short description from the impact DRS content. Let's go to the timeline. Oh, okay. I have the same clarification. I think I presented to you at the last truck, this one, because we plan to have this project effective date July 1st. And we made available, I think on June 16, we posted the posted a draft Vpm on an emergency basis that makes all those clarification on what you should do in order to designate one of your resources as run-of-river. So please follow this. Go to the Vpm market operations Vpm, and on section 2.1.16 you'll find this those instructions in case you want to have some resources designated as run-of-river as of July 1st. Move to the next slide. Okay, for the CC tariff clarification, we have a single TBD here. I think this one is because we're evaluating if training is necessary. We haven't got yet the final answer on that, but by the next ROG and in some weeks, we'll let you know where we stand with the training for this project. Next, upcoming, go back for one slide. I want to draw attention to you that on the 26th, which is tomorrow, we plan to post the draft configuration guide documentation only. So that's that. Let's move to the next project, CC Debbie. Let's move to the next slide. All right, July 6th. What I want to say on this project, as you can see, it will be filed on July 6th, tariff filing, refiling, basically. No, I'm sorry, this is the filing, right? And I understand, given that the ongoing conversation that went on between ISO and market participants, this initiative is becoming less contentious. So our expectation is that FERC will take about 60 days to provide an answer, and we'll ask FERC to give us a decision by middle of September, with an effective date no later than end of the year, which means we have a feasible path for October 1st implementation date. So we plan to follow that. We plan to complete the market simulation in the same window as the fall release project, and deploy the project, activate the project on October 1st, assuming that FERC will give us a positive answer by middle of September. Those are the updates and news I have on the CCDD Phase 1 project. Moving to ESER 3B, that's a slide that you've seen also on the TUG meeting regarding the DRS, the fact that we have some changes to the URL for that system. This was communicated previously. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, on this one, we plan to file tariff middle of July. The project is doing well, progressing well, and will, I think on external training, looks like we have completed external training on June 22nd, so this week, which means we're advancing the project on the planned timeline, and we plan to be ready for the market simulation July, August, and production activation on those 2 dates, DRS and low shift product. Go to the next slide, please. This is the graphical representation of that timeline with multiple events. We introduced this more than a month ago. Hasn't changed. Again, this is for your information and reference. We introduced a new slide in this MPPF update that was presented this past Tuesday on the technical user group. The fact that we are upgrading the Web SDK platform for DRS system, and the UI look and feel has changed slightly. And we want to be fully transparent to you and point to you about some look and feel changes that you may notice in the BRS system. I think our technical leads have discussed this at length in the TUG meeting, so I'll just move on then to the next slide. Same thing, information that was presented at the TUG. EIM Enhancements 2020. Slide 125 is for the content of the project. Let's move to the timeline. Next slide, please. Okay, 27. Thank you. That's where we have that change I mentioned earlier, that the technical specification has been delayed 1 week. We have high confidence that we'll be able to meet that timeline, July 2nd. And that we plan to post the ABC report specification and some slight updates, I guess, to feasibility and load conforming data. So those are the updates we have for this project. Let's move on to the next project, FERC Order 841. This hasn't changed. FERC asked us to make some changes to our prior filing. We'll have some configuration guides that are coming on June 26th. Vpm changes coming and training coming in July. The project is on track to follow the full release timeline implementation. FRP improvements, buffer and min. This project also doesn't have any changes based on prior updates we provided you. We posted external BRS in May. We plan to have all the VPMs posted by July 20th, training on July 14, and the project follows the normal fall implementation timeline. ADS replacement. Okay, this project has some updates I want to present to you today. So I think Jamie Herget told you in the last RUG that she plans to set up a customer partnership group to discuss and agree with you on a timeline for how we can deploy the ADS replacement project. And she sent a market notice, and in that market notice, she's announcing that CPG will happen on July 9th. Please, if you're interested in this project, please attend that CPG. What I have in red here is a draft of what you will see us proposing on that CPG, which will say we plan to run the market simulation for the ADS project on the same timeline like the full release in August. And then at the end of August, after the market simulation is completed, we plan to start a 2-month parallel operations window for you to have access in our stage environment, which is the environment that mimics the most our production environment, and in which environment you can execute an end-to-end process. And if that exercise goes well, for those 2 months, we plan to activate the ADS replacement project by November 4th. Now, for the decommissioning, let's stay on that one. One more update I have on ADS. Decommissioning of the old ADS, Jamie is proposing to have a 3-month overlapping period from beginning of November until February 1st, which is November, December, and January. So that she's proposing a 3-month window in which market participants should move completely to the new ADS systems. So more details and discussions will happen in that CPG. I would recommend that you participate in that CPG and talk to all our subject matter experts and Jamie on that meeting and discuss any details you want related to this upgrade. For now, that's the plan. Let's move to the next slide, please. Dispatch operating target tariff clarification. Again, the project has ADS components, and because of that, is moving to the November 4 activation. But the market simulation window remains July 27 through September 4th. Same thing for the next project. Let's move one slide, please. Intersite deviation settlement. Again, market simulation, we plan to have it the same timeline, July 27, September 4th. Activation date, November 4th, because of the ADS section in the project. Okay, the last few projects for the fall release, it's excess behind the meter production. So let's move to the timeline for this project. One more, please. Yes. BPM changes, looks like July 20th, like a lot of other projects. Then external training in July, again, ahead of the market simulation window as all the other projects in the fall release. And deployment will be October 1st, but the effective trade date will be January 1st, 2021, as we agreed with market with all of you earlier in the planning process. The last project in the fall timeline is the market settlements timeline transformation. I think I mentioned on this one where I want to draw attention to you see in red, we have the market simulation ending on September 18. All the other fall release have it as ending on September 4th. So this is because the structured scenarios for this project are planned to be executed on the starting middle of August, and by the time we run all the scenarios and recalcs and all the things that you need to see before the end-to-end process is vetted, we may need to extend that window all the way to September 14th. The general note is that we plan to complete all those exercises for market simulation by September 4th and September 18th for this particular project. It doesn't mean that the map stage environment will close after that. The map stage will continue to stay open, and as I said previously, we plan to keep that environment available to you at all times, except for the maintenance or deployments when we communicate that outage on the environment. The reason we are mentioning those timelines for the market simulation is we want to keep it as a focused effort, both from us and from you, and complete all the exercises and vetting of all those fall release projects, in this timeline, so that you would have a buffer month for final tune-ups, I guess, on your system before going live, and that will be on October 1st, November 4th, or January 1st. All right, I think those are all the, okay, let's go over this one and then I'll take questions. On spring, the spring release is dedicated to the EIM entities. I mentioned this previously. This slide has been in this deck for quite a while. We have 5 EIM entities coming on April 2021, and they're on track to meet all the EIM implementation timelines, planning to start the market simulation in December and parallel operations in February and March, ending with, we hope to get certification from FERC by early March, 30 days ahead of production activation in April. That's all the updates I have. At this point, I'll stop for any questions.
You can enter the question queue by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. Are there any questions in the queue for Adrian?
Going to our next question. Caller, please go ahead.
Hi, Adrian. This is Chen Liu. I'm from PG&E. Alicia Kenyon, I have a question. So now it's going to be delayed and also look like there's a market sim window dedicated to it. So does that mean that you guys are going to have structural test scenarios for Aliso Canyon?
We don't have structure scenarios for that, and we haven't heard from any market participants that we need a structure simulation for that one. Again, we'll support the market simulation, unstructured market simulation for the project, but so far we haven't concluded or found a need for a structure simulation for that project.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Next question, caller, please go ahead.
Hello, Adrian. This is Albus Moda at PG&E. Going back to the slow demand response, I had a couple of questions or comments, really. So my understanding is that this is a flag that allows certain demand response resources who wish to be available in that way. They can be called via exceptional dispatch after the running of the day-ahead market. So they're not dispatched in the day-ahead market, and then they will be called via exceptional dispatch after the day-ahead market, but in the afternoon before the day of the call. I'm concerned if there are a lot of such resources that there would need to be a procedure defined and a better way of communicating than simply making a phone call to communicate an exceptional dispatch, because in our case we might have 40 or 50 such resources, and the ways in which they're called might vary because of their availabilities or because of how the ISO is doing it. So I'm a little concerned about there not being any procedure defined for calling those slow demand response resources by exceptional dispatch. And the related issue is if the availability of those resources changes after the day-ahead market has run, normally if it were a demand response resource that could be called in real time as well as day ahead, it would be possible presumably to use the OMS system to indicate that the availability of the resource was different or to become unavailable or whatever. And then would like to tee up the issue of whether the availability can be updated. Certainly, almost 8 or 9 hours after the bids are put in the morning, it's possible that more will be known about the availability of those resources for the next day, and that would be important for how much you're likely to get out of calling such resources.
Yeah. Thank you, Alva. Right. I think what I would recommend to you, number one, looks like I'm looking at the slide, from John's presentation. I have another version of this presentation on my other screen, and I think it looks like he plans to break the board on July. I would recommend that you make known your concerns in a city ticket or directly to our policy people. I'll tell you, I felt a little bit. I'm getting that I was getting a little bit ahead of myself of publishing those upcoming changes or upcoming plans in this RUG call because I think the process would be for the Vpm to fully brief everyone on our plans, and for the policy to solve those or have that conversation. Then we have the PR process for the Vpms, and then but there are questions about that flag, and I was trying to provide as much information to you as I could. So that was my update. Again, please log a city ticket if you want to express some concern, participate in the policy, or reach out to John Gooden on that one. We'll implement, the agreed policy that comes from our policy group.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to make those comments because it looked like the description was on the slide was not as what I would think would be complete for. It basically just indicates there's just going to be a flag, and that's it. And I don't think that's all. That's the entirety of the implications for the ISO. I'm hoping that you will simply create a complete version of that slide if there are, or perhaps you'll just come back and say, no, we're just going to call by phone and you don't get to change anything, and that's that, and that's fine as well. But so that's possible, but that's what the plan is. I'm just asking the question, really.
Yeah. Okay, I'll take this slide. I'll ask our subject matter expert to vet it for accuracy again, and maybe I should invite someone at the next ROG meeting that could carry this conversation better than I am, because I'm not expert on this topic. Thank you for the comment and kind of the explanation you have there about what we should clarify, I guess, for you on the impacts of this policy to all of you.
Are there any other questions in the queue?
No further questions for this section.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Adrian. So we'll wrap up today's call with just a few ways how you can stay informed and participate in releases. So you can visit the release planning webpage on the California ISO website, as well as attend meetings like the release user group, which through that user group we provide initiative status updates, as well as any system change updates on independent releases. You can also participate in market simulation calls. You can visit the ISO calendar to find meeting dates and times for those calls, and they're typically held on Mondays and Thursdays. And then lastly, by participating through the Market Performance and Planning Forum. This slide shows bi-monthly review. It's actually quarterly calls that we have for MPPS. And so what to look for on the calendar, market sim calls, again, usually occur on Monday and Thursdays, and then release user groups are on Tuesdays. So we have 2 more MPPFs for this year. The next one will be on Wednesday, September 9th, and then we have another one on Tuesday, December 15th. All of the MPPF-related materials are available on the recurring user group and meetings webpage on the California ISO website. And if you do have any agenda topic suggestions, please submit those suggestions through city and select the Market Performance and Planning Forum category. And then you can also send an email to ISO Stakeholder Affairs at CAISO.com. So before we wrap up, I also want to share that the ISO is launching a new commenting tool here soon. Through this new tool, visitors will be able to view all comments from a single click rather than having to open multiple PDFs as it is today. This tool will provide the ability to filter the comments by entity or by question, and stakeholders can submit their comments directly into the tool, which will in turn help us reduce the risk of transferring viruses to the ISO through email attachments. There are 2 exceptions to this. One is if a user needs to submit a formula or a diagram with their comments, and then the second being during the tariff development phase when users submit redlined Word documents. One important thing to note is that once this tool is launched, it will require a one-time registration, and then after registering, you'll be able to sign in with your email address and password and then comment on initiatives. So I will open it up for any last questions before we conclude. Again, you can enter the question queue by pressing #2. Mickey, will you let us know if anyone enters the queue?
I will.
Are there any questions? Okay, well then that concludes today's Market Performance and Planning Forum. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services, and you may now disconnect.